is happening in America and what it's doing within the mindset of the people of early 19th century. Because as the Second Great Awakening began to sweep across America, it began to stir hearts and inspired countless individuals to seek a return to primitive Christianity. Out of this environment arose several restoration movements, each sincere, each striving to recover what had been lost. One of the most significant was the Stone Campbell movement, which gave rise to the Christian Church and the Disciples of Christ. Their goal was to strip away creeds and return to the Bible as the sole authority. At the time, the Adventists, hey, Jessica, welcome.
Hey. Sorry, it's been taking me a little while to get my kids wrestled. Hopefully my son will be good. He's just playing right over here, so I don't know how long I can stay on, but I wanted to come on and just listen to your cool presentation that you had ready and give any thoughts when you're ready for whatever you got. But keep going because it's pretty good. I was just watching.
All right. So um if you don't know Jessica, she has a channel called Christ Pearls. Highly recommend going to her channel. She's got some really good stuff. One of the most significant movements that came out of the Restoration movement was the Stone Campbell movement, which gave rise to the Christian Church and the Disciples of Christ. And like I said, their goal was to strip away creeds and return to the Bible as the sole authority. At the same time, the Adventist and Millerite movements emerged, emphasizing the imminent return of Christ and a renewed focus on prophecy. And so the Millerite movements were more disposed to the eschatological aspect of fulfilled prophecy or realized eschatology and what is to happen. They're looking for the return of Christ. And then you have the other groups like the Shakers and the various communal restorationists sought to recreate the purity of the early church through radical lifestyle changes and separation from the world. All of these movements reflected a shared yearning, the recognition that something vital had been lost, and the desire to restore the faith of the New Testament church. Yet here is the key distinction. While these movements were sincere, they lacked divine authority and priesthood keys. They could reform, they could reinterpret, but they could not restore. That is why the restoration through Joseph Smith stands apart. Unlike the other branches of 19th century landscape, Joseph Smith's calling was not born of human effort alone. It was initiated by God himself through the first vision and subsequent revelations. Christ reestablished his church with the same authority, priesthood keys, and the ordinances that existed in the apostolic within the apostolic era. So when we look at this tree of 19th century movements, we see branches reaching upward, but only one rooted in divine restoration. This is the pivot tree where the Lord's true church was reestablished on the earth. Now, one of the first things we emphasize today is the proper name of the church. President Russell M. Nelson has reminded us that names matter. By using the full name, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we place Christ at the very center of our identity and our discipleship. This emphasis is not just about words, it's about focus, direction, and testimony. Along with this came a shift in teaching focus. Rather than relying solely on Sunday instructions, the church has moved toward a home-centered, church-supported model of gospel learning. This shift empowers individuals and families to take greater responsibility for their spiritual growth. The Come Follow Me program is the centerpiece of this change. It provides a unified curriculum for individuals, families, and congregations, ensuring that all are studying the same principles together. This program is designed to deepen conversion, strengthen homes, and make gospel learning more consistent and personal. In 2018, President Nelson gave a promise that as we embrace this pattern of gospel learning, the heavens will open, revelation will flow more freely, and our ability to hear the voice of the Lord will increase. This was not just an invitation, it was a prophetic promise of spiritual power. And this ties directly into the vision and mission of gospel learning. The goal is not simply to gain knowledge, but to become true disciples of Jesus Christ. Gospel learning is meant to change hearts, strengthen faith, and prepare us to stand firm in a world of shifting values. Central to this process is the role of the Holy Ghost. The Spirit is the true teacher. While manuals and lessons provide structure, it is the Holy Ghost that confirms truth, inspires application, and brings lasting conversion. Without the Spirit, gospel learning is incomplete. Finally, we must see all of this in its historical context. From the time of the apostles, the church has always emphasized teaching, revelation, and understanding how to live. And over the centuries, much of that was lost. But in this dispensation, the Lord has restored not only his true church, but also the pattern of learning that leads to revelation and discipleship. And so when we look at this, historian Will Durant offers a sweeping view of Christianity's rise. He explains that it emerged from Jewish now I can't talk apocalyptic um, roots, drew its power from the life and resurrection of Christ, absorbed elements of pagan faith and ritual, and eventually adopted the organized genius of Rome. Through this process, Christianity transformed into a dominant state religion. But at the heart of our study lies the foundational claim that Jesus Christ himself personally established his church. He called and authorized apostles to minister, to heal, and to teach in his name. This divine authority was central to the identity and mission of the early church. This leads us to the universal apostasy question. We are examining the historical evidence for a general falling away from that original divine church of Christ. If Christ established his church with authority, what happened to it after the apostles were gone? The role of the apostles is critical here. As Paul wrote in Ephesians 4, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers were divinely appointed to equip the saints, build unity of faith, and guard against false doctrines. Their leadership was meant to preserve the church's purity and direction. Yet when we look at the contrast in history, we see that the early unity and authority of the church gradually gave way to doctrinal shifts, cultural assimilations, and organizational changes. Over time, the primitive church was altered, and the original pattern established by Christ and his apostles was lost. This historical trajectory sets the stage, the need for restoration, not just reformation of Christ's true church. When we speak of divine authority established by Christ, we are talking about something far greater than human organization or tradition. And from this, we look at the central aspect: Christ conferring priesthood keys upon his apostles. These keys represent the right to direct the work of God on earth, the authority to govern his church and administer his salvific ordinances. With those keys comes priesthood power. This is not simply symbolic, it is the literal power of God delegated to man. Through this power, miracles were performed, the sick were healed, and the gospel was carried forward with divine authority. Alongside power, there is priesthood authority. Authority is the right to act in God's name. Without it, no ordinance, no teaching, no act of ministry can be binding in heaven. This is why Christ's personal establishment of his church mattered so deeply, because only he could bestow that authority. And finally, we come to the heart of the matter: salvific ordinances, baptism, confirmation, the sacrament, temple ordinances. All of these require priesthood authority to be valid. They are not merely rituals, they are covenants that bind us to Christ and open the way to salvation. Without divine authority, ordinances lose their eternal efficacy in relationship to that.
Yeah, I like that. I like how you're helping with the distinction is the authority, right? Like you've mentioned this like pattern of ordinances and authority and prophets being called and given authority. And it's a good question to stop and like think, okay, where did the authority go after these apostles died? And I know that there's been some debates about that. And I love how you showed like the different I don't know, like the different arguments that were starting to form like right after the apostles passed away. It's like, well, who has the authority? And I think in like Latter-day Saint view, and even like during the time of the Reformation, it's like there seemed to be a realization that that authority no longer was there, that there wasn't any like true authority.
Right.
So I really like how you've got this all laid out. So anyone who's like wondering how to teach the great apostasy should refer back here. Anyway, keep going. I liked
Yes.
how you laid that out.
Well, it's just how it comes together, because it's important to understand this. And when we grasp the understanding of it, we can grasp the beauty and the simplicity of the gospel and the reality of what needed to happen and occur And like we talked about last night, there was a very finite window of this restoration to happen, and it was ripe for that time period when Joseph Smith received that first vision of the Father and the Son appearing to him. And so I think this is a very important groundwork to lay down and understand and have that grasp. So when you do have people ask you questions, you can actually answer that and be confident in assurance of knowing the reason behind why we need to have prophets, why we need to have apostles today, why there needs to be the priesthood keys, the authority to guide his church, the reason for the salvific ordinances. And and I think that when we have that understanding, we'll be able to stand even firmer in our faith and our testimony.
Yeah,
And so
this
that
makes me think of did you pull in anything about like the allegory of the olive trees or any of
no,
those kinds of
I
things?
didn't pull any of that in.
Maybe that's for a future one because I think there's like a tie in here because it does illustrate in that whole allegory in Jacob 5 like
Right.
this whole thing that happened right here.
Right. Yeah, and that would be a great point to bring into that. So I'll have to look at how this is going to be laid out and where that would fit in with this whole discussion. Like I said, this is going to be a 36 episode series. So
Yeah, no, I know
we're
you have
just
a lot
laying.
planned for it, so it can come later, but this is really good foundation and like really great groundwork that you've done. I like it a lot, Tim.
Yeah. So when Christ established his church, he did so through apostles and prophets, giving them divine authority and priesthood keys, as recorded in Matthew 16:18 through 19. These keys were the foundation of his church and were directly tied to the performance of salvific ordinances, baptism, confirmation, and other covenants essential for eternal life. These ordinances tie into the atonement of Christ. And so those keys unlock the atonement, the power and the efficacy of the atonement so that we can receive the forgiveness, the salvation, and later on receive exaltation and progress through the eternities after this life. So for a time, apostolic leadership provided church-wide supervision. We see in scripture the apostles guided the saints, corrected false teachings, and ensured unity of faith. But by the middle of the first century, the leadership began to disappear. And the part of that is bringing us to this critical point. And this critical point is this: apostleship did not perpetuate through men divinely called by revelation. Without new apostles chosen by Christ, the line of authority was broken. And without that divinely appointed authority, no surviving organization could rightfully claim to be the Church of Christ. So now it's true that early Christians preserved some core teachings, faith in God, baptism by immersion, and belief in the resurrection. But without Christ authorized leadership, those teachings lacked the binding power of priesthood authority. Over time, the very word Christian broadened. It came to be applied to churches and movements that had departed from the original teachings and authority of Christ. This reality was confirmed in the first vision when the Lord told Joseph Smith that the churches of his day had forms of religion but denied divine authority. They had remnants of truth, but they were not his church. Yes, remnants of Christianity did endure. There were always sincere believers striving to follow Christ as best they understood. Yet sincerity alone did not restore divine authority. Christ himself did not recognize those churches as his true church. So when we use the term Christianity today, we are often referring to evolving traditions, denominations shaped by history, culture, and human interpretation. But that is not the same as the unchanged church established by Christ in the meridian of time. As we begin this study, it's important to acknowledge its limitations. Our purpose is not to assign blame or to determine who may have been responsible, nor are we attempting to pinpoint the location where it may have originated. Those kinds of questions, while interesting, are not the focus of our discussion. Instead, the focus is on what took place within Christianity itself, the causes, the developments, and the patterns that led to the apostasy. What we will see is that apart from the loss of divine authority, the process gained full momentum toward the end of the first century. This period also coincided with the fulfilled promises of the day of the Lord and judgment marked by the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the scattering of the Jewish people in the fulfillment of the Jewish diaspora. That event closed the Second Temple era and reshaped the religious landscape in which Christianity was developing. From there, we will be comparing the changing and evolving church over the centuries, tracing how doctrines, practices, and authorities shifted. The historical and theological evidence shows a radical departure from the original teachings of Christ. And it is this departure, not individual fault, that defines the actual apostasy. So this study is not about pointing fingers. It is about understanding the historical process and recognizing why a restoration of Christ's true church was necessary. The primitive Christian church faced enormous challenges in its earliest centuries, challenges that shaped its future and contributed to the eventual apostasy. First, the Roman Jewish wars and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD were a turning point. This is not only a political and cultural catastrophe, but also a prophetic fulfillment. With the temple destroyed and the Jewish people scattered in the diaspora, the early church lost its geographic and cultural center. As Christianity spread, the church struggled to gain political power and authority. At first, it was a persecuted minority, often misunderstood and targeted by Rome. Over time, however, the temptation to align with political structures grew, and this pursuit of influence began to reshape the church's character. Meanwhile, doctrinal and theological changes crept in. Without the apostles to guide and correct, new interpretations and philosophies blended with Christian teaching. This led to confusion, division, and a gradual loss of the original purity of the gospel. The religious attitude of the masses towards salvation also shifted. Many believers began to see salvation less as a covenantal relationship with Christ and more as participation in rituals or adherence to institutional authority. This change in mindset weakened the personal transformative power of the gospel. Even the worship of early Christian believers began to evolve. What started as simple, spirit led gatherings centered on Christ and his ordinances became increasingly formalized, ritualized, and influenced by surrounding cultures. At the heart of all these problems was the loss of divine authority without apostles and prophets holding priesthood keys. The church could not claim to be the same church Christ had established. What remained were fragments, sincere believers, partial truths, and traditions, but not the fullness of Christ's church.
Yeah, I think that's really
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's really good, Tim. I one thought comes to my mind. So like you talked about the authority, and I think this is something that even I think even in our view we recognize that um, there was a point in time where people started to feel inspired, like Martin Luther, John Calvin. I think that they did feel inspired. They did recognize that there had been practices and doctrines that had been changed or lost. And it seems like the way we view it is that they tried to reform, based on the organization that existed at that point. But there's so many problems that enter in with this idea of like reformation versus restoration. And I love that you're laying down this groundwork because I think you can see that a restoration is needed. Just as you realize that there is this thing of authority that backs ordinances, because ordinances, they're not just done like you don't, in our view, we don't just go and get baptized, right? Just to show that
Mhm.
we want to follow Jesus. A lot of people do, and that's what baptism is for them. We do it for more than one reason. It's to show that we want to follow Jesus, but it's also through this certain authority so that we enter into a relationship that is recognized on earth and in heaven, or like recognized by God's priesthood power and authority. And the way that we define priesthood is a little different. We do define it as the authority and power of God. And we see that God has given this power to man to act in his name all across the scriptural canon. We have these examples. And so in our view, an ordinance has to have the authority backing it in order to be efficacious or to be recognized by God. This explains why we do baptisms for the dead for people who've even received a baptism. It's because we understand this concept of authority. And I think it's interesting how with the Reformation period, and even though people could see how this like slow kind of what you're describing here, this
Mhm.
apostasy crept in, it's like, well, what do you do with that, right? And it seems that um, even Joseph Smith didn't seem to understand or recognize that until he prayed and asked
Right.
and had the first vision. It's like he prayed to know which church was true, and the answer he received was none of them. And that was kind of a surprise because it seems that he didn't anticipate that answer.
Right.
So I like how you've laid it out, because you can kind of see where things are getting off track, and then and then it makes sense how we ended up with this like period of Reformation, and how the things were in that time preceding Joseph Smith, like with the Pilgrims and
Right.
just all of this like spiritual revival that was happening. You can see why. It's because over a period of time, people started to see how far off track it was getting without that authority.
Yeah, and that's important. And because that goes into the very next point here, because there were always rays of hope throughout Christian history. Faithful individuals and movements sought to preserve scripture, to live according to conscience, and to keep alive the memory of Christ's teachings. These rays of light prepared the way for the eventual restoration, when divine authority would once again be established here on earth. And so, getting towards the close of this, um, we return to the central question that has guided this, that's going to be guiding this study. Was the answer to the decline of primitive Christianity found in Reformation, or is it found in a true restoration of the gospel? Because hopefully, through this process, we've examined the trajectory of the primitive Christian church, tracing its rise under apostolic leadership and its gradual departure from the original authority and teachings of Christ. We have explored the reason and historical precedents of an apostasy, a falling away that was not sudden but progressive, as divine authority was lost and human traditions took its place. We have also considered the reason and necessary of a restoration, beginning with Joseph Smith's first vision, when the Lord declared that the churches of the day had forms of religion, yet lacked his authority. And this study has traced the historical and theological developments of an apostate Christian faith, showing how doctrines, practices, and structures evolved over centuries, often diverging from the original pattern set by Christ and his apostles, which we will be getting into, which is going to be the next few episodes of this. And then finally, we're going to see how the restoration fulfilled the rays of hope that many sincere Christians held onto throughout uh, Christian history. And those who longed for greater light, for truth, and for the return of Christ's authority on earth, they were actually looking forward to it, much like we are looking forward to his coming. The message is quite clear. While Reformation sought to repair what was broken, only restoration could bring back the fullness of Christ's church, complete with divine authority, priesthood keys, and salvific ordinances. And so, in this first part, Christianity was born into a world that was anything but welcoming. The Greco-Roman world was filled with competing philosophies. And so, next week's discussion, next week's presentation, is going to be on Christianity in the Greco-Roman world, and we're going to focus on Christianity and the contemporary pagan world, and how all this actually fits in its historical context. Because the Greco-Roman world was filled with competing philosophies, diverse religious practices, and a culture often hostile to the message of Christ. The early church faced constant challenges, not only from political powers, but also from the mystery religions and hero redeemer cults that promised salvation through secret rites and mythic figures. These movements posed a real threat to the fragile Christian community, offering alternatives that seemed attractive to the masses. And yet, despite the competition, Christianity spread rapidly. Why? Because it offered something radically different: a living Christ, a universal message of hope, and the power of divine authority. This is where our study now, because in the next episode, we will see how Christianity stood in direct competition with these religions and why, against all odds, it not only survived, it flourished. So, as we close out this introductory uh, study, the call to action is this: don't just study Christianity in isolation, see it in its world, in its historical context. Understand the environment of the Greco Roman world helps us appreciate the courage, conviction, and divine power that propelled the gospel forward. And so I invite you to join me next week. We'll probably have a separate episode to have a discussion on this, and we'll see how this goes. Any
Yeah, I
final
think
thoughts?
that's cool. Yeah, I love it. I love that you're like trying to help illustrate just from our point of view, like how do we see the great apostasy? What is it when we say great apostasy? This is something unique to our view. But I think ultimately, you know, restoration differs from reformation in that reformation means that you're reforming or modifying an existing organization,
Mhm.
and you're I guess, trying to return it to what it once was. But once that authority was lost, in our view, the only way that that could be like could actually return was for those keys of priesthood to be returned to the earth. And there's some really great scriptures that maybe throughout the series we can get into, and just kind of how we interpret those scriptures based on our understanding of this great apostasy. There's one that actually comes to mind, and I don't know if it's okay to share it, Tim, but it goes with what you're saying, and it just talks about the foreshadowing um,
Hmm.
that occurred in the scriptures. Like an example, so first of all the classical prophets, like I look at these and to me they are clearly prophesying that this great apostasy would happen. I think Daniel
Right.
chapter 2 is one, the whole book of Isaiah is another, but even in Amos chapter 8 verses 11 through 12, just kind of paraphrasing, it says, behold, the days come that I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. And people shall wander from sea to sea, and from the north even to the east. They'll run to and fro, seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it. And the way that we view that is that it's talking about this great apostasy that God knows is going to ensue, but there's a whole purpose for that. I think that's where the book of Isaiah and the book of Daniel can really help. Jeremiah, he's another prophet that I think prophesied these things,
Right.
but all of these prophets prophesied these things, these classical prophets in the Old Testament. And so I don't know, it'll be fun to, I think, spend time on that and see how did this apostasy unfold, and maybe try to find a few scriptures that illustrate the prophecies that foretold that this would unfold. Would be maybe a fun addition to your series, something to think
Right.
about.
Because that's why I like that manual. It's got it all laid out. I'm just updating and adding additional information and
Yeah,
pulling from scholarly peer-reviewed journals and just giving that added oomph to this to say this is not just some fanciful thing that just was conjured up and this is a very real event that people don't really take seriously because they mock, they criticize, they say, well, it hadn't happened. Christ
yeah,
Church was perpetual, but they don't understand the historical context of what really happened. And I don't think as
yeah.
members of the church, we don't really grasp and understand the reality of the apostasy.
Well, I think
And
if we really understand the Old Testament, and we don't, I don't think members of the church do, but maybe that's something you can bring to the table here, Tim, because there's so many prophecies that prophesy the great apostasy. Even Revelation chapter 12, there's a whole great apostasy theme going on there. And granted, you can, hi Michael, you can you can kind of, you know what I mean? Like you can read
we're
it at different times and different, applications with that type of vision. But definitely there's an apostasy that's foretold. And I think that when you cross reference between like the book of Revelation, what I just read in Amos chapter 8, and then
Mhm.
also with these Old Testament classical prophets, it's really easy to see once you like dig into it that this was foretold, that God knew it was going to happen, but there was a purpose for that. And today I was teaching my children in homeschool about the American Revolution.
Mhm.
And one thing that I really am enjoying about homeschool is how I can incorporate the scriptures. And I had talked about First Nephi chapters 13 and 14 that prophesied about the whole Christopher Columbus period and the colonization of America, and just all these prophecies that speak to how the restoration was going to begin. And it started in that era where people are exploring and they find this new promised land. And so I love what it builds up to, what this series can build up to. And so I'm excited to just contribute where I can when I can. So thanks for letting me come on and enjoy your series, Tim.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, and yeah, we'll see if everybody's up to just actually having a panel discussion on this information. Because I want to present it, and then we can just come together and then have a midweek kind of panel discussion when everybody's schedules fit.
Yeah,
If
that
it
would be really
happens, it
fun.
happens. But I
Well, and if we can't do it like this week, like, you could even do, like, a couple of sessions, like, or a couple of presentations, and then we could just do a panel about, like, 2 of them or 3 of them at a time, just whatever fits in terms of how it groups together, because that could work
Right.
too, and then you could kinda, like, plan it out, and I would love to participate in that. I think that's really great. I think this is gonna be a good series. I love the amount of work you've put into it, and, yeah, I think anyone who wants to study The Great Apostasy with us, follow Tim's channel, and, um, yeah, it'll be fun.
Yeah, and as a reminder, if you want the resource, you can download the PowerPoint presentation by going to scanning the QR code. That QR code will give you the opportunity to you do have to sign up for a Patreon account. It's free. But if you want to support, you can get a paid membership, but it's all free. You can download the PowerPoint, you can download the actual message um, that I prepared. They're 2 separate documents, and then you can use them for your Sunday school lessons. You can use them for your classes. You can use it for your own personal study. It's there for you to use. And if you just want to say, hey, I appreciate this depth of study, and you want to make a donation, that's great. You can do that by becoming a member, or you can scan the QR code, and yeah, that's all I have.
Well, I gotta bounce, but Tim, that was awesome. So you're doing it every Monday at
I'm going to try to do it at least every Monday, because I think this would be a good Monday family home evening type thing
yeah.
on
I have a
this.
hard time getting on, like, that early on Monday, but I'll try and where I can if you want me to, I'm happy to,
Yeah.
but I love it. I think this is great, and even if you just do it on Monday night as, like, a presentation, you have it set up for that. It looks really good, so everybody follow along and see what you learn, take some notes. If you haven't fully understood the Great Apostasy and how things split up, Tim's got a lot of great resources prepared on this. He put a ton of work into it, and I'm super proud of him, so this is cool. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me on
You're
for a few
welcome.
minutes.
All right, everybody, you have a great day, and be blessed, and be encouraged, and be inspired.